the traditional owners of the land of where I am located, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and we are on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So a little bit about the Unison Research Lab. It's a collaboration with RMIT University. It was established in 2017, and it is designed to undertake innovative research and education programs and to offer a unique industry-led approach to addressing ongoing issues in housing and homelessness. We believe the partnership is incredibly important, not only for informing how Unison delivers its services, being that we understand what works and what doesn't work, but also it's incredibly important to inform the community, government, local council, both state and local council, on policy and understanding housing and homelessness better. It is the only program of its kind in Australia, so we're pretty fortunate to be a part of it. And the lab comprises of 6 dedicated research staff, being led by Professor Guy Johnson, who's with us today, Dr. Sarah Taylor, who's also with us. The research was the involvement of Dr. Juliet Watson was also involved, and I'm sure she'll be with us here today as well. And today we're going to discuss the research Maximising Impact. As the name conveys, the aim is to understand what factors contribute to tenancy sustainment, and therefore how we as a social housing provider can maximise our impact. This research is of significant scale. It follows 170 new Unison tenants over a 2.5-year period. And today we'll be sharing with you the baseline findings. Thanks, Juliet. She chucked in the chat. Nice to have you on board. And today we'll share with you the baseline findings. We want it to be interactive, so please, I know Juliet just used the chat, but if you can use the Q&A function at the bottom, we've allowed a lot of time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. And with that, I'll pass over to Guy Johnson.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start with a few thanks. James has mentioned a couple of people already, but I've got a few others I'd like to thank. A very big thanks to the Unison place managers. They were critical in terms of recruiting people for the study. And it went for quite a long time, the recruitment period, and people put in for us, which we appreciate a lot. I'd also like to thank Kat and Celine from the comms team at Unison for putting this together. Knowing that how much of a technophobe I can be, they've done a remarkable job, and fingers crossed I don't push any wrong buttons. Another big thanks to the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, who provided some funding that enabled us to employ a research assistant. That made a huge difference in terms of data collection and also retention, which I'll talk about later. And finally, just to my colleagues, James has already mentioned them, but I'll mention them again. Dr. Sarah Taylor, who's leading the project, Dr. Juliet Watson, who's been critical right from the formation of the project and the development of the project, and also Erin Tyrrell, who has done a tremendous job in collecting data for the project. So I appreciate all of those 3 people. Before I hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk through the findings, I want to provide a brief background to the study. There is quite clearly a recognition that as much as getting people out of homelessness is a challenge, keeping some people housed is equally challenging. And as the number of tenancies that social housing providers take on board from the priority waitlist, it's highly likely that this challenge is going to become even more complex. As James said, we wanted to find out why some tenancies stick when others do not. We also wanted to go deeper than looking into individual biographies and housing histories and connect processes of residential instability and residential stability with other factors such as neighbourhoods and neighbours, the built form and the availability of various forms of social capital. So what we did was we designed the study called Maximising Impact. Maximising Impact's a longitudinal panel study that drew its sample from new tenants in Unison's housing stock. There's 3 questions, which I'll just raise and then answer, which gives you some more information on why we decided to do it this way. Why new tenants is the first question. Basically, we wanted everyone at a similar and comparable point in their tenancy. That was really important. What's a longitudinal panel study? Well, a longitudinal study tracks people over time. And as James mentioned, we're tracking 170 people. We're going to interview them 3 times over a 2.5 to 3 year period. By tracking people over time, we can observe changes in key areas of their lives. In the baseline survey, we looked at the following. We looked at their personal details, their education and training, income and employment, financial stress that they're experiencing, their physical and mental well-being, had they experienced trauma, their housing histories, their experiences of neighbourhoods and communities, albeit short-lived at that stage, social support, and their experiences of violence. In subsequent surveys, what we call Wave 2 and Wave 3, we include more detailed questions on their neighbourhood and community, as well as questions about housing satisfaction and housing management, trust and stigma, pets and parking, as well as some COVID-specific questions. Our study is a longitudinal panel study. A panel study tracks the same group of people over time. It is more challenging to do a panel study, but it is also a more robust approach. We could have done a survey every year, a bit like what the AIHW does with its housing satisfaction survey. But we would not know if any of the changes we observe are a result of different people responding to the survey or if they're actual changes in the level of satisfaction. A panel study can help us avoid this. There are risks though. Anyone familiar with longitudinal studies will know that one of the biggest risks is what we call attrition. That's the loss of respondents over time. If your attrition rate is high, your results can be severely compromised. We had 170 baseline interviews and we're close to completing Wave 2 interviews with a response rate of around 70%. That means an attrition rate of 30%. So we're doing okay. Today, we're going to present the baseline results. It provides a clear insight into who Unison houses. I'll hand over to Sarah now, who will go through some of the key findings. Sarah.
Thanks, Guy. And, let me just share my screen. Can everyone see that? Great, so I'm going to go through some of the key findings from the baseline report. For more detail, you can download the full report from the Unison website. The key takeaways are that Unison does house tenants with a high level of disadvantage relative to the wider community. And of the 170 tenants that we spoke to, they had many experiences in common, in particular, low income, long-term labour market disengagement, and housing instability. And a key point there is that it's long-term. It may have started suddenly, but it's certainly not temporary. Many of the people we talked to have spent years outside of the labour force or outside of stable housing. As much as they have these things in common, the low income and the housing instability, they do vary widely in a lot of other measures. So there's a lot of variation in physical and mental health, drug and alcohol issues, experiences of violence, and also basic things like age and background. And we know from other research that these different attributes will interact with differences in the housing and the neighbourhood and will influence tenancy sustainment and tenancy satisfaction. Another key point is that across the vast majority of measures in the report, the degree of disadvantage was more severe for those that had previously experienced homelessness. And in particular, it was more severe for those who had experienced primary homelessness. So that is sleeping rough or squatting. And finally, a key point is that nearly 60% of the new Unison tenants that we spoke to had previously been in a social housing tenancy. And that points to the importance of this kind of research. It's important to get people into housing, but it's also important to understand why people leave social housing, what works and what doesn't work for tenancy sustainment. So throughout the report, in most cases, we arranged the data according to housing biographies, so the tenant's previous experience of homelessness. 84% of the tenants we spoke to had previously experienced homelessness, and that's compared to about 13% in the wider community, so it's a very high rate. The first group of the 3 housing biography groups is the primary homelessness group. So that's tenants who have at some point in time, not necessarily straight before this tenancy, but at some point in time, they had experienced primary homelessness. So that's sleeping rough or squatting. That's 51% of the people we spoke to. The secondary homelessness group is tenants who at some point before starting this tenancy had experienced secondary homelessness. So that's staying with friends or family, aka couch surfing, staying in a refuge, crisis or transitional accommodation, but they hadn't actually squatted or slept rough, and that's 33% of the people we spoke to. And lastly, the never homeless group. So tenants who had never experienced homelessness, but to be clear, these are people who were very much at risk of homelessness, and it's a good thing that they haven't experienced homelessness. And there's some interesting attributes about this group. 16% of the people we spoke to, they do tend to be a bit older and are at risk of homelessness later in their lives. Looking at demographics, a first key point, which Unison would be well aware of, but I'm not sure about everyone else, is that Unison houses a lot of single person households. So single person households are about a quarter of the Australian population as at the last census. A little over half of social housing tenancies in Australia more generally, but amongst the people we spoke to, 71% were single person households, and comparing that to the Unison administrative data, that in the administrative data, it's about 74% of Unison tenants are single person households. So that's an example of when we checked the representativeness of the people we spoke to against the wider Unison tenancy pool. The tenants in the primary homelessness group are, broadly speaking, more likely to be aged in their late 30s or early 40s, and they're more likely to be male than female. Tenants in the secondary homelessness group, again, broadly speaking, they're more likely to be single parent families with dependent children, and very much related to that, they're more likely to be female headed and to be a little bit younger, so aged in their 20s and 30s. And lastly, the tenants in the never homeless group, they're definitely more likely to be older people, single people who are perhaps aged over 50, and again, have experienced less stable income and housing later in life, perhaps contrary to previous cultural assumptions about what can happen when you get older. 66% of the respondents we spoke to were born in Australia. That's a higher rate for the primary homelessness group. And of those who weren't born in Australia, there were 35 different countries, and really not any one particular background or language group amongst them. 4% of the respondents identified as Indigenous, and absolutely all of them have previously experienced homelessness. Looking at income and employment, and again, a key commonality for these tenants, that as much as they vary in other respects, a key commonality is a low income, and a low income over a long period of time. So the vast majority of the respondents were reliant on government payments as their primary income source. And also they'd been reliant on that for quite a long time. So on average, over 8 years. A little under half were receiving either a disability support pension or a parenting payment or some other non-labour force participation payment. 44% were receiving unemployment benefits, which I'm sure we're aware are not usually very generous or very stable. And the unemployment rate for the primary homelessness group was much higher, so close to 58%. And bearing in mind that's often for many years, so many years on a very low income. Nearly 12% were in paid employment. It wasn't necessarily their main source of income. That may change post-COVID. And in terms of the longer term employment histories, we do see a lot more variation in that respect. So 70% did previously at some point in the past have a full-time job. But of course that means that 30% have never had a full-time job. And we have some people who've worked full-time for a long time, many people with degrees. Most of the respondents had completed high school, but not all. and really a lot of variation in that longer term employment and education. But more recently, over the last few years, what they do have in common is many years not as part of the paid workforce. So on average, more than 7 years out of paid employment for various reasons. And as we know, close to half of them are receiving unemployment benefits, so would like to be part of the paid employment market. And to reiterate, we have many single person households. We have people on low incomes, and in the case of unemployment benefits, very low incomes over a very long time. And what that means for housing is in terms of private rental, it's nigh on impossible to find affordable private rental on that kind of income. And you might be looking instead at rooming houses, which have a whole range of other problems associated with them. So Unison does provide a really important role in housing low-income people, low-income single-person households. But there are some catches to that, and a more obvious one is that single-person households cannot pay as much rent. And as we go through these slides, we'll see some pictures on the left of some properties owned by Unison. So this one's in Collingwood. Another commonality for the tenants is long-term housing instability. So on average, nearly 3.5 years had passed since they had last been in a permanent home, and that was much higher for the primary homelessness group. On average, they'd moved 2.5 times in the preceding 12 months, and that's not including the move into this tenancy. And we see lots of signs of difficulties keeping housing, which would relate to low income, but also to other factors. Just one example of that is the proportion of respondents who had received a notice to vacate or been evicted in the past, which is about 1/3. We also have a high rate, looking at people's longer term housing, quite a high rate of people who spent time in state care when they were growing up, so 29%, that's much higher than the wider community. And for the primary homelessness group, it's very high, so 41% had been in state care when they were younger. And for the primary homelessness group, 64% had their first experience of homelessness when they were 24 years or younger. And we know from other research that the younger you have your first experience of homelessness, the more likely you are to have long-term episodes of homelessness. And in terms of that state care question again, on the one hand, it doesn't reflect particularly well on state care, but I think more broadly, it highlights the invisible buffer that keeps a lot of us out of homelessness, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. For many people, it's social capital, social networks and family networks, and big accounts with the bank of mum and dad that keep many of us out of homelessness. And you can see what happens when you don't have that. There's very long-term exclusion from stable housing. Looking at health, we know from other research that low income is not good for your health. We also know that homelessness is very bad for your health. Interestingly, low income, and specifically low income in an environment of income inequality, is associated with a lot of negative health outcomes, chronic health outcomes. And homelessness, if you already have some health conditions, it will only exacerbate it. If you have some problems already, that will get worse from homelessness. And because we are speaking to a population that overwhelmingly has low incomes, and many of them have experienced homelessness, we see that coming through in the data. We have a lot of people with chronic health conditions, much higher than the Victorian population generally. More than 2/3 have 2 or more chronic health conditions. That's far higher than the Victorian population in general. And a further point is that chronic health conditions also do relate to age. Part of that is just part of life, but we do see it coming through in the data with the never homeless group. If you recall, are older on average. They do report chronic health conditions and poor physical health. But here we see a really important role for social housing and for Unison. If you have chronic health conditions and you're older, you definitely don't want to be staying in a rooming house or experiencing homelessness, because whatever health conditions you have are definitely not going to be improved or manageable if your housing is not pleasant and it's not stable. So the property we see on the left here is in Altona. There's a lot of Unison tenants there who are a bit older. They're not exactly of retirement age, but they're certainly older. And the tenants we spoke to there, they do seem to like it. It's not really close to the action, as some other Unison properties are in Footscray or Fitzroy, but it's a very pleasant environment, and it's a great place to age in place, because we know from other research that the older a tenant is, the more likely they are going to want to stay put, and it's better if they stay put in a place that's actually good for their health. And finally, 65% of respondents have been diagnosed with a mental health condition. Mental health conditions were just common across the board, including but not limited to those who had experienced homelessness. Just unfortunately very common amongst the people we spoke to. The main difference is that for those who had experienced primary or secondary homelessness, they were much more likely to have been hospitalised for their mental health condition in the past. An interesting domain that we do talk about in the report, and one of the few examples where your housing biography doesn't really predict your responses to the questions quite as much, is in terms of violence and safety. So feelings of safety and violence are definitely going to impact on tenancy sustainment. And if a tenant doesn't feel safe, it will override many other things that might be working in a tenancy. Violence is a gendered social issue, and we see that in the data. In terms of physical violence, for both men and women, the rates are unpleasantly high, but not as gendered. So for both men and women, just over half had experienced physical violence prior to the age of 18, and a third in the preceding 12 months. Looking at sexual violence, 56% of women reported unwanted sexual contact prior to 18. That's double the rate reported by males. And for men, if they'd experienced violence in the last 12 months, in 8% of cases, the perpetrator was a current or former partner, but the rate for women was enormously higher at 61%. And that has a lot of ramifications for tenancy sustainment and tenancy satisfaction. How safe these tenants feel, and indeed how safe they actually are, is going to have an enormous impact on how well the tenancy goes. We asked some standard questions about how safe tenants felt, whether at home or outside. And across all those questions, female respondents felt less safe than men, both at home or outside. As an example, 27% of female respondents felt safe walking in their neighbourhood, and that's compared to roughly double the rate for male respondents. That's not actually unusual compared to similar questionnaires for the Victorian population. Men always feel safer outside walking compared to females, so that's repeated in this data, but certainly the overall feelings of safety are lower in this group, and they are gendered as well. So lastly, and leading into the follow-up reports as well, in yet another example of how much your preceding experiences of homelessness are likely to impact your answers to questions now. We asked tenants, to rate their overall satisfaction with life on a scale of 0 to 10. And those who had experienced homelessness in the past, and to be clear, it is in the past, they're just less likely to be satisfied with their lives. It's an example of how much homelessness can have a lasting impact on your health, on your social networks, on how you feel about others and yourself. It has a really lasting impact, and we can't change that, but we can be aware that it's going to have a lingering effect. And with you see that in the data here with the overall satisfaction rate for the tenants who hadn't experienced homelessness was quite similar to the Australian population in general. And we also asked tenants to rate what was most important to them in their lives. And tellingly, they rated having a home as the most important part of their lives. Interestingly, we might see that change over time. In a weird way, you might want it to change because you think a lot about having a home when you don't have a stable home. And the respondents tended to rate other features, of a fuller life much lower, like hobbies and community and religion. They were all rated quite low, but we might see that change over time as people settle into their housing or don't settle into their housing. Thanks. So I'll throw back to James now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Guy, really informative. And, you know, Unison, we pride ourselves on housing the most vulnerable within our community. And obviously, we are committed to that cause, and we actually deliver on that, showing the data that's just been presented. So I noticed that our Q&A platform hasn't been flooded with questions. And I'm sure you might once you digest the information. So in the Q&A, oh, here we go. Did you collect any information about people's housing, such as location and design?
I'll take that. Yes, we definitely do. And part of that we know from Unison. We don't ask so much about the design of their previous housing, but we have asked whether they've stayed in rooming houses and things like that. But we definitely are interested in the house and the neighbourhood, what it's like, what they like, and that's going to come up much more in the following surveys, where we ask about maintenance, what they like about their house or don't like, what they'd like to change, and so forth. So we know for tenancy sustainment that it's a combination of the tenant and the tenancy. The building really does matter a lot, and getting the right building for a tenant is very important. So what will work for one tenant won't necessarily work for another one, but obviously there's good design principles that apply across the board. So the Unison has a range of buildings as well. You've seen some of the pictures, maybe some of the more high profile Unison buildings, but they also have scattered site, standalone houses throughout the community, as well as the apartment blocks. And some are more low rise, some are high rise, and we'll definitely be taking note of that, as well as the neighbourhood and neighbours.
I'll just add on that, because it was new tenants, most of them had just moved in, so they just sort of weren't into the rhythm of the house. Many of them were very relieved just to be housed. So we'll get a much clearer picture of how they're living, what their life's like in their housing in Wave 2 and in the Wave 3 survey. Okay,
thank you. Next question. If a person misses an interview, are they still part of the study?
I'll take that, sure. Obviously, we like to follow up with people, but they have to they have the option, of course, to actively withdraw from the entire study and say, I would like you to not use my data at all, or they can miss one interview, but we'll follow up with them for the third interview. So there are 3 interviews overall, and by missing the second one, it doesn't exclude you from the third one. And we do give a bit of a window where we try to get the highest number of interviews as we can, up to a point. We don't want to be just making it difficult for people, but there is the option to skip an interview, the option to withdraw, and we try our best to sort of work within those constraints.
Thank you. Next question. About a third of people were born overseas. How did you deal with people for whom English was a second language?
So we had a few of those who were born overseas. Some of them spoke English as a second language. Many of the baseline interviews were pre-COVID, so those interviews were a little bit easier in person. Sometimes we would use the online interpreter service, depending on the language level that was there, and that was enormously helpful. Usually those interviews would take longer, but it's extremely valuable to get that information, so it was more than worth it to stick at it for that. It was easier in person, where you can kind of figure out how to communicate with people in a more human sort of way. In the more recent interviews, they've all been phone-based, and again, we try to follow up every possible interview, and that includes if English is a second language, and so that's been phone interpreter services in phone interviews. So we try our best. It certainly is. It takes more time to get interview material for those who speak English as a second language, and we had a really wide variety of languages, which I think reflects on the wide variety of people that Unison houses.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Next question. Guy talked about attrition. If panel members have since left Unison housing, are they still included in the study?
I can deal with that one.
Mhm.
Yes, they are. And in fact, if they've left Unison housing in some other form of housing, particularly private rental, it will provide some interesting insights and points of comparison. So we fully expect some people will leave and be in other forms of housing. And some people, unfortunately, will probably be back in the homeless population. So they're very much included if we can find them. And that's obviously the challenge that we have with a longitudinal study.
Okay, thank you. Next question, and I'm assuming this is in the general sense, but why did people leave their previous housing? Was there a common theme?
My recollection, Sarah, you might add to this, was there was a variety of reasons. And given that a lot of people had been in unstable housing circumstances for a long time, they actually hadn't had a home, I think was 2.5 years on average. So there's numerous reasons for leaving homes or houses or living arrangements, and there's many movements in between, but clearly issues to do with violence, to do with affordability, to do with suitability, to do with the behaviour of others are common themes that we see in the data, not just in this study, but more broadly speaking as well in the Unison administrative data sets. Have you got anything to add there, Sarah?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Just a wide variety, and for some, the memory of a permanent home is quite a long time ago, so there wasn't just one reason, but certainly affordability and violence and stress are big parts of it, and as well as just mixed in with a overriding pattern of not having a lot of social capital to work with. One example comes to mind, a lady who'd moved into state because of family violence, and then once she was in Melbourne, she spent a lot of time couch surfing with her daughter. So obviously each time she moved, it wasn't really because there was anything particular wrong. It was just not a great situation. And the final move was she'd been living with her daughter in someone's garage for a long time, and the person who owned the house didn't like children. So just very unpleasant ways to live as part of a wider pattern of low income and violence and instability. So she was very chuffed to be in a tenancy.
Great, thank you both. Next question, is the high percentage of single households in the study a representation of available housing stock or of demographic need, i.e. more single people require social housing?
Again, I can probably get Sarah to elaborate on this, but we did a recent study that looked at private rental options available to single people, and there just simply weren't any.
Yeah.
And we were looking at areas which are generally quite affordable. So the housing needs of single people are not well catered for in the private market. And that situation is clearly exacerbated as you move in towards the city. Now, the housing market's in a state of flux as a result of COVID. Things may start to loosen up in the private rental market, but not to the extent that I think single people will find it easy and affordable in the private rental market. Sarah, again, you got some.
Yep, very much agree with that. So there's, of course, there's wider trends in Australia towards more single person households. That's a wider trend anyway, but the basic maths on affordability for private rental and low income is it's pretty brutal out there. It may change, but it's almost none. So the other option that comes up, and which we've also looked into a lot with our research, is private rooming houses, and that's where a lot of single people on low incomes have been. And I'm not sure if people know, but that certainly up until this year, there was a really huge number of private rooming houses out there in the suburbs. And technically, they're just affordable. You could pay for a room, but there's a lot of stressful outcomes that come with living in a private rooming house, or even indeed in a community rooming house. So they had been absorbing a lot of the need for single person households, but that, pretty unpleasant, deeply unpleasant actually. So until private rental is affordable to single people, and until rooming houses are not nasty places to live, and I don't think the latter will change much, there will be a need for affordable housing for single people.
Thank you. Next question. When will you finish the interviews, and when will the final results be available?
Okay, well, as I mentioned, we're well into the wave 2 interviews, and we'll wrap those up early next year. We've started wave 3 interviews. We're doing these different interviews sort of concurrently because people started at different times. I would expect, this is one of the issues with longitudinal studies. They take a long time and it can be quite frustrating waiting for the results. Nonetheless, I would expect sometime around June 2022, we should have some data, whether we've got a report prepared at that stage. But June 22, I think, is sort of a key time for us in terms of both wrapping up the analysis and hopefully producing some a report with some key findings.
Great, thank you. Question. You mentioned differences of profile between Unison tenants and general population. Are Unison tenants similar to people in social housing in general?
It's a question I wish I could answer. Part of what we've sort of said here is that we only really seem to have, there's exceptions, but we only really seem to have broad information about the social housing population, their age, their gender, their household type. That sort of nuanced information, that sort of rich, fine-grained information that we've presented here that just demonstrates the level of disadvantage, and it is severe in this population. It's not generally available. It would be good if we knew who was being housed, but we don't. This is Unison's and our contribution to sort of starting the ball rolling to a better understanding of who is actually being housed in social housing.
Great, thank you, Guy. Last question. What do you think the impact of COVID will be on people's ability to find and sustain housing?
Big question. You want to go first, Guy?
I will.
I'll get my crystal ball out. And
I'll make this point. Social scientists are hopeless at prediction. And we are in a turbulent time, a very dynamic time where things are changing. Who could have predicted a week ago that we would have had such a significant announcement around social housing? And that's clearly related to COVID. We've got housing markets which are shifting. We've got labour markets which are moving, and all of these are going to come together in ways which we just don't quite know how it's going to sort of operate out in the ground. Clearly, there has been substantial investment in social housing, but we've also, the income protection that we've seen recently has been absolutely critical, and we can't ignore, as much as our focus is on housing, income protection, the level of income support people get is absolutely critical. Now, we know we're going to fall off the cliff on job seeker soon, or job keeper, and what job seeker is, it's not entirely clear. So, I mean, I don't like people that are sitting on the fence, but I think it's actually really far too early for people to be making predictions. What we have seen, though, is that COVID has had a disproportionate effect on low-income households and often migrant households. So the level of risk that they're experiencing, and this is sort of echoes the unfortunate situation in the States, is the level of risk and the level of accrued disadvantage is likely to be higher amongst some of those populations. So I think we've got to be very sensitive and attuned to rapid and substantial shifts in key structural indicators that really haven't moved too much over the last few years. It's a terrifying time, it's an exciting time. Good things can happen and so can bad things. So I'm going to sit on the fence and wait until we've got a bit more clarity and so we can see a bit further into the future.
Great.
Sarah might be more prescriptive.
I would certainly bet that, like a lot of social phenomena, that whatever happens, as much as we report on COVID numbers in aggregate, the results are going to be very spatially differentiated. So it's going to come through geographically, and we're going to see the impact on people in different ways depending on where they are. So I think it's going to change a bit of the geography of housing market. Certainly in Melbourne, maybe more people wanting to move to the country, or it's certainly not new that public health issues impact more on people with low incomes and more in low income areas. So that's not new, and it doesn't look like it will change. But then the weird effect of something that affects a lot of people is that it has surprising outcomes like more social housing. And in terms of that bigger network that keeps a lot of us out of homelessness, you know, the various banks of mum and dad, if that is affected in the long term, then we might see changes in who's using social housing, and probably less of the trend towards having to be very, very unusually disadvantaged to get into social housing. We'll get hopefully a bit more of a push for it to be a broader part of life. But again, it's the future. My only main prediction is that it will be uneven, and it will be very spatially uneven.
Okay, thank you both. I jumped the gun a little before. We have got some more questions, and considering we've got time, I think we'll jump into them. So what impact has COVID had on the study and the findings, if any?
I can start with that again, Sarah. I mean, one of the things that I've always done, and we did it in Max Impact as well, is face-to-face interviews are really important. And it's particularly in longitudinal studies where you're trying to build some rapport and engagement with people who you're interviewing. It was also important because we also got to come into people's houses that in general invite us into houses, and we'd make sort of a sense of where they lived. And that sort of qualitative information is really important to understand. Or it's a very nice place, but rubbish outside, or whatever it may have been. COVID just stopped it, stopped it dead in its track. And our researcher, Erin, has now, it's got to be all done by phone. And phones, whilst it's convenient in some ways, we don't have to travel and all of that. Phones aren't a particularly endearing way to do interviews, particularly when you're talking to people about scales, on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever it may be. So it can make the work more challenging. We don't know if it's had an impact in terms of the retention. It's just, we're just simply not clear about that. Baseline, it didn't affect. It's affecting wave 2 and it's affecting wave 3. But I've got to say, we've also added some COVID questions. Now, we fully expect COVID will skew the results, but we just don't know in which way they're going to skew the results. There's been some interesting sort of discussions amongst the research team about the impact of COVID. And at one level, we see a significant impact, and at other levels and with other respondents, no impact at all. But clearly, when you're doing a study of this sort, and something as substantial as COVID comes right in the middle of it, you've got to be very in tune because it's going to affect your results. And we're conscious of that. And we fortunately have some clear dates around when COVID first appeared and when the second wave came and so forth. And so we'll have to sort of control for that when we do the final analysis, or at least take that into account.
Great, thank you. Next question, and I like this question. Have the research been surprised by any of the results so far?
Sarah?
Well, there's a few. I'm sure Guy will have different ones. Some pleasant surprises, some unpleasant. So how long someone can be on New Start for is not a great surprise, but I had it anyway. It's an enormous amount of time that people can seem to endure, and I admire it, but I don't think it's a great thing, can endure that kind of experience of filling in those kinds of forms for that many years. So people are capable of enduring a lot of little humiliations over a long period of time. I don't think it's a good thing. Another little things around houses, people like things in houses that other people hate. A lot of people didn't like rooming houses. Occasionally people don't mind them that much. Little things make such a huge difference, like having your own bathroom and having your own kitchen. It comes through again and again how important that is to people. And I guess if you have your own bathroom, you don't think about it that much. But if you don't, if people have been living in rooming houses, it's just this thing that we take for granted now, or most of us do, that is just enormously important to people. And it's great to have it there. I hadn't thought about it, but now I think about it. How some people feel really unsafe and other people don't. Like some people just have their blinds way open and other people always have them closed, and how much that related to people's histories. And finally, little things like parking, public transport, and pets, which we're going to follow up in the next interviews. Some people have really cute little pets, and they're very important to people, very, very important to people. And you don't know about people's pets until you go into their home. And for some people, they really want a car and car parking, and other people couldn't care less. So it's actually really great to talk to people about what's important to them. And you just don't know until you actually talk to them.
A couple of things stood out for me. One was there is a sort of a narrative in Australia around poverty that it's a short-term experience for most people. And many people do move out of poverty, only have a short experience. But there is a population for whom it's an enduring part of their lives. And that's who we were talking to in Maximising Impact. The second one is that, I mean, I've done a number of studies of homelessness, particularly the chronically homeless, and the similarities with some of the results around state care, drug use and so forth were frightening in some ways. It just spoke to a level of long-term disadvantage and housing and labour market disengagement. And just a final point that as Sarah touched on during the presentation, and it's something that interests a number of scholars, and it's this scarring effect of homelessness, the long-term implications of being homeless. And it's not just the physical consequences of being homeless, it's your sense of place in the world. And how that's shattered, and how that stigma of homelessness can follow you for a long, long time afterwards, and how people self-assess themselves. And that's something we sort of tend to underestimate. We tend to look at their housing needs, their health needs and so forth. But this issue of being totally disconnected from the community and not feeling like a part of it, like your experience is always shadowing you, is very familiar. And we start to see that again here in their self-assessment on life satisfaction and so forth. So they were three things. I suspect the future Wave 2 studies will provide really rich information around housing, and we really want to get our teeth into that, what makes a nice house for people, because as Sarah alluded to, people make home in very different ways, but they certainly make home, and it's fascinating how they do that. So we'll get a better sense of that in the next round of interviews.
Thank you both. A question for me. Nice of someone to get me off the bench. What do you intend to do with this study? So obviously the baseline findings are important. It reiterates Unison's position in housing the most vulnerable, and I'm glad to see that we actually are committed and are delivering on that. The actual findings from the Wave 2 findings will inform what we do in terms of assisting tenants to sustain their tenancies more. That's in short. There's an economic, obviously, an impact of tenants falling in and out of homelessness, and we know they do. But more importantly, understanding what we can do as an organisation to have maximise our impact for those individuals creating a home. So the more we understand about what works and what doesn't, the more efficient our service delivery can be and how we house people. Lastly, were the tenants you interviewed receiving or linked to support?
Sarah?
Oh, yes, so we did ask them that. So that's one of the specific questions. And yes, some of them are linked to a range of support agencies and others were not. So that's part of the questions we asked about people's support networks. And we asked them how often they were in contact with them. And we asked them again later, and that certainly did vary. Some people, were in contact for support for drug and alcohol or mental health issues and so forth. I think the level of support definitely varied. Some of them I would just catch up with them occasionally, and others it's much more hands-on. We obviously think that would make a big difference. So there's having support, then there's what that support actually means. And that does tie into another research project that Unison and the lab are engaged with, which is looking at those other support agencies, because Unison it's a housing provider. So there's this weird sort of combination of you get into social housing often through those other agencies, and Unison doesn't necessarily know that much about their tenants, and sometimes won't know that something is wrong until much later. And we think that probably the support agencies could be actively helpful in that regard. But of course, it speaks to that the fact that Unison is a housing provider and they're not meant to be directly offering support in other domains.
I'll just add on to that. I mean, this is again the benefit of a longitudinal study. At Wave 2, we'll get a much better sense of the intensity and duration of support, and if that's making a difference. Whether we've got a big enough data set to sort of interrogate that statistically, we'll find out soon enough. James, I'm just conscious that someone, Matt Daly, has sent through a comment via the chat, and I'm happy to address it if you'd like me to.
Absolutely.
Okay, Matt, sorry for identifying you. In New South Wales, CHPs appear to have an aversion to including common areas such as rooftop gardens, etc. Do you feel that the architecture or built form should encourage social connections? It's a good and interesting question. In part, what I think doesn't matter. What we're trying to find out is what the tenants think and whether they'd use that. We get mixed, in past studies, we've had mixed views about common areas, where they can be areas where there's intimidation and standover of vulnerable people, to other areas such as what we've seen emerge at the Common Ground facility, where it's the rooftop garden is a valued space. Now, it just took time. So I'm not sure if that's answering it directly, but this is really, for us, the assumption that tenants want to mix is something that we want to interrogate, because it's not always the case that people do want to mix with their neighbours. We can't presume or take a sort of a middle class perspective that neighbours want to mix. And so we've got to be careful, and that comes into the built form. So we will find that out in greater detail as a result of wave 2 and possibly wave 3.
Yeah, and I would definitely add to that the built form plays a large role with how people interact with their neighbours, how much they hear of their neighbours, and what kind of social interactions do occur. And based on what I've seen thus far, I think that communal areas can be good, but you should hope for the best and plan for the worst. So work with the idea that at least one neighbour is going to be not a good neighbour, and go from there. Because a bad neighbour can make life very, very unpleasant for people, but obviously social interactions can really work when they work well.
Great, thank you both. And I think in that chat, we're about to put up an email address. If you've got any questions or you've got feedback, please feel free to email our taken away some really interesting facts from the data, the baseline, and we'll follow up with an email to you all with the actual report and an executive summary, or you can find it on our website. So thank you all again. That concludes our webinar, and I'm sure when we launch the next wave of research, hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.